Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me for today's LinkedIn Live audio event. I'm just going through, I can see a whole bunch of folks have joined, and I am responding to hand raises. Now, I had two planned speakers with me this morning, Helen McKenzie, my fellow Art of Procurement team member, and Heather Foch, who is the founder and toner queen. We have royalty with us today at Quality Imaging. She's going to be representing sort of the supplier point of view in this discussion. Everyone is, of course, welcome to listen in, but if at any point you're interested in joining us on the speaking floor, it's actually very easy to do. All you would do is you would raise your hand and ask to speak. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the listening panel. As I see those hands go up, I'm glad to promote you to the speaking floor so that you can share your point of view. If this is your first live audio event, there's not actually sort of a sideline chat. So if you do want to share your point of view beyond the little emojis, you have all the reaction options. I'll look for those as well. But really raising your hand and asking to speak is the best way to be brought in and share your point of view. So as we get started and as I give just a very brief sense of what it is that we're going to talk about today, Helen and Heather, if you guys want to go ahead and unmute, and I will say hi to you. We'll make sure everybody can hear you. Good morning, Helen. How are you?
I'm good, Kelly. Hopefully you can hear me this week. Last week when I was on trouble with my audio. So, yep, I'm here.
You are an old pro now as far as LinkedIn Live audio events go. And how about you, Heather? Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. So this is your first LinkedIn Live audio event. It's actually a great, easy to use format. I'm not so big on the video. I'm far more comfortable with the audio events, but just so that nobody misses out on the full experience, you can just imagine me talking way too much with my hands, probably overly emoting. It's just I'm not going to have to go back and watch it afterwards. I will also share with everybody, both Helen and Heather, as well as for everybody who's listening in and might decide to join us on the speaking floor. While LinkedIn does not record the session natively, I'm using a tool called Loom to go ahead and record, because that way anybody that wants to listen into our conversation afterwards who happens to miss it will have that option. And so I will be sharing the recording shortly after we finish this morning. So this conversation is part of my LinkedIn Creator Accelerator project, which is focused on supplier diversity. It's a 10-week project that started January 10th and runs through the third week of March. And so each week of the project, I've sort of focused on a different theme. You know, we started with what is supplier diversity? Why is it important now? What are frequently asked questions? And this week is where we start to actually get into some of the operational realities of making supplier diversity work. Now, while supplier diversity first and foremost means large corporations intentionally spending and awarding contracts to minority-owned, woman-owned, veteran-owned, LGBTQ-owned, disabled-owned, active combat disabled-owned veteran businesses, as well as hub zone businesses, small business is actually a really important part of this. And so some of the businesses that have diversity certifications around owner identity also have a secondary certification as a small business. But even the ones that don't have that secondary certification are often much smaller than the companies they're partnering with through these diversity programs. And so it's some of those challenges that we're going to talk about today. Now, Helen and Heather have already seen the results of this, so I'm going to give you very quickly the findings of last week's poll, which were focused on this topic. I had asked for procurement professionals or supplier diversity managers, when your company is working with smaller suppliers, what are the primary complaints? Let's be honest. What are the primary complaints that you hear about? And I had offered up 4 options. They were slow processes, slow payment, onerous contract terms, and lack of human contact with the customer. The poll results closed last night, and it was interesting. We actually had an overwhelming tie for first place. Both slow payment and onerous contract terms tied at 38% apiece. In third place, I had slow processes at 16%, and then lack of human contact with the business at 9%. So at least we can, for the most part, check off that concern, unless it's making ourselves available to help deal with slow payments and contract terms. These smaller suppliers are not actually looking for a whole lot more contact with us. So Heather, as our supplier representative in this conversation, I want to ask you, first of all, are you surprised? Are these responses what you would have expected? And then what do you think about the fact that slow payment and onerous contract terms actually tied and represent almost 80% of the responses that we received?
Well, Kelly, I'm not really surprised at all by the results because as a small business owner, the contract terms and how gigantic and boilerplate they can seem, as well as slow payment terms, usually are at the forefront of any small business because we're trying to grow and we need, all of our funding to be able to grow our business and make sure our own suppliers and business partners are paid on time. My experience with the pandemic was an interesting one. I think I went through a period, when the lockdown happened, that March of 2020, I think I had maybe 3 or 4 months in that time, like basically through the summer, where all of my customers were paying late, and it was only because they weren't physically in the office to write checks. But thankfully, I had capital enough to sustain my business and still make sure my suppliers were paid on time. And once we got through that summer, things started to go back to normal. But I pretty much gave my clients leeway when it came to payment terms because they were going to be in the same position that I was in. So I took the position that if I could financially withstand being flexible, then at the end of the day, I'm passing that along to them. And maybe that helps their other suppliers, that helps their other business partners that they're with. And so I felt if I was able to sustain that, then I was hoping it would create a trickle down effect where, other small businesses maybe that they were doing business with would feel that in some way too. The contract terms, man, I participate in a lot of bidding with government agencies, and I would say that's the biggest thing I usually see, especially if they ask for certain mandatory requirements on top of the boilerplate T's and C's as well. And most of the time, half of those things, at least in my aspect, don't end up applying to what my commodity is. So I usually try and end up trying to have a conversation with procurement about that, if I get to the stage where we're in contract negotiation. But I'm not surprised at all. The last option, the not being able to reach them is often, I've never really experienced it myself, so I wasn't surprised that the top two choices were, regarding slow payments and the contracts.
Yeah. Now, one follow-up question for you on that, and then we actually have the right person on the line to talk about public sector procurement. Helen has a ton of experience there. But, you talked about being fortunate enough to be financially flexible or to withstand those late payments. Did the customers that you were extending these truthfully generous changes in terms to, did they at least communicate with you and keep you posted? Did you have a sense along the way that, okay, such and such a company or agency simply is not in the office, won't be there until X date? Did you feel like you had the information to make that decision, or did you simply know it just wasn't there yet and you had to make the decision for yourself what you were comfortable with?
I would say probably the first 2 months of the lockdown, I really didn't get much information, and it was just because people weren't, the work from home thing wasn't set up for people yet with a lot of businesses. And a couple of my largest customers are in dental and healthcare, and their business is physically being in their clinic offices. So if they aren't physically there, communication really isn't happening that much. But thankfully, once I got to be around like May, even June, I started hearing, trickling in with customers reaching back out to me, and everyone was super apologetic to what the situation was. And really, I just had to just be empathetic in return. Everyone in the whole world was dealing with the exact same thing. So it really wasn't going to benefit me to get all up in arms and upset, that I had clients that were late paying. Most of my clients have been with me almost 20 years. And so I've got great relationships with them. So I wasn't about to, damage a relationship over a late invoice. I just kind of grinned and bear it and gave them that allowance and time to get back to normal. And then once everyone was back and starting to trickle back in, everyone was getting caught up with their payments. So I think, because I was generous and flexible to them, I was going to be put on the forefront on who was getting paid first when they came back.
So Helen, let me bring you in on this here. So I'm going to promise right up front, we're not going to hold you accountable for all government agencies everywhere. So don't worry about that. You're not on the hook for all of that. But from the perspective of the public sector, can you give us the buy-side perspective on those onerous contract terms that Heather talked about a little bit?
I think it's something to do with risk management. So in the public sector, which is slightly different from business, but not uniquely different, is that if something goes wrong, the accountability is extremely public. It'll be covered in the media, politicians will be asking questions, etc., etc. So generally speaking, when it comes to procurement, the legal advice that we get in terms of how we should frame our contracts is very risk averse. So how people tend to manage risk is they try and get rid of it all up front by putting every single contract term and requirement they can possibly think of up front. So I think there's something there around risk aversion that I would explain public procurement's practice with. One other thing just to bear in mind is a number of things that we buy in the public sector we do on a collaborative basis. So a buying organisation might be doing something on behalf of a range of public bodies. So if we think about the UK, the government in Westminster there would put the contract in place for mobile phones for everybody in the UK to use. So that'd be everybody from the Ministry of Defence to a tiny little public body in North Wales, somewhere like that. So again, the contract terms that these colleagues would put in place cover everything from sort of military defence to tiny. So there's something around that which I think is quite interesting. But what I think is interesting about the contract terms, I just think it's lazy. I just think people are using their boilerplate contract terms to go, to put a requirement in place across procurement, whether it's public or private. They're not thinking through about when the appropriate time to manage risk is, and they're just sticking it in up front without any thought of what that means to a supplier. And the biggest example of this is insurance. That you sort of had a standard amount that you need a supplier to be insured for, and whether that's proportionate to what you're actually buying, who cares? We're just going to stick it in. And for a lot of suppliers, that premium for that insurance, for something you might not even be successful in a sourcing exercise in securing the work, why would you bother? So I've got thoughts about payment terms, but in terms of risk, that's what I think there.
Well, and it's so interesting that you point out the boilerplate, right? And Helen, you and I are on the buy side. We've now worked a little bit, sort of, on the supply side, in that we now provide, consulting and content services to procurement, but we can sort of see both ways. So there's that huge boilerplate contract template that, even if it's not perfect, right, has been blessed by legal or whatever the appropriate agency representative is. And when you think about risk, if we as procurement professionals alter that boilerplate, we're sort of transferring the risk of what ultimately happens onto ourselves. Whereas if we stay with something that's been, blessed for use, even if it doesn't totally fit the situation, in theory, we personally are more protected. And one of the things.
Sorry, Kelly.
No, go ahead, Helen.
I was going to say, and the whole category management movement and best practice, sort of standard terms and conditions, boilerplate, T's and C's were part of that sort of move to bring up the quality of procurement and what we did, and thinking about how we might do things consistently. So, we have got that backstory of this being part of a move, better practice that a lot of people have adopted.
Absolutely. So in addition to having Heather here with us this morning, I had also spoken to her previously, and some of her thoughts are actually going to be in the newsletter. I'm publishing my very first Procurement Buzz newsletter through LinkedIn this morning, so be on the lookout for that. But one of the learnings that I found was particularly powerful that she shared in those comments is that she has learned, being a smaller business, that as you go through this process, everyone is by default going to give you the boilerplate. And it's on you as the business owner to read that boilerplate and speak up about the areas that are problematic for you. So Heather, let me bring you back in and have you sort of in your own words share, the situation that we're talking about here, where Helen has given us, I think, a valid perspective on risk. No one wants to take on risk, but sort of the ownership that small businesses have to have around, yes, actually reading the whole boilerplate contract, no matter how painful it is, and making sure that the terms you sign on to are okay. What is that process actually like to go through as a business owner?
Oh, geez. I would say definitely like the standard terms and conditions are pretty much the same for every agency I think I've ever gone into a bid process with. But my experience and what I've learned just being in sales is you have to ask the ask. Because the worst thing that anyone is ever going to say is no. And is that really the end of the world? It's not. So what I have started doing over the last, 5 or 10 years is if, it's not really about the standard T's and C's, because again, those are about payment terms and invoicing and, all sorts of random things. It's really more in the other detailed specs and requirements they ask for, particularly for my commodity area. So for me, I'll look at those extra sets of conditions that they're asking for. And if something sounds weird, like insurance requirements, like Helen mentioned, or delivery requirements, I'll just ask the buyer, hey, here's how my business model is. This is how I run my company. That, XYZ don't really fit into what I'm doing. Do I have to agree to do those things for you if really that's not something I'll be doing for you if I get the award? And 9 times out of 10, I'm able to open that door and have that conversation. And most recently, it helped me ended up participating in a bid situation with a local agency where I had reached out to the buyer and said, hey, if these are strict requirements, I'm not gonna waste your time by submitting a proposal and reviewing it if me not agreeing to those couple things is going to disqualify me. And then the buyer ended up coming back right away. Very communicative buyer, by the way, came back and said, go ahead and submit a proposal anyways. It's fine. So I did, and I ended up getting a 5-year contract with them as a result. So if you don't ask the question, you never know what the answer is going to be. And I think sometimes small business owners feel maybe they don't want to come off as being too small, for an agency to do business with them or a company to do business with them. So they don't ask the question because they don't want to hear what the possible answer might be. But I actually be surprised that the answer is usually more favorable than people think.
Absolutely. And again, this is actually sort of the point that you were making earlier about once people got back to the office, they were communicating. These complexities are going to arise in business. Business is messy. As much as we want to think we've streamlined our processes and we have all of these digital tools, just the way the world works, everything continues to be sort of messy. And it is that human to human, who can I email directly? Who can I pick up the phone and talk to? I imagine you've had plenty of opportunities to sit back and reflect on when situations go well, like you reaching out to that buyer and saying, hey, some of these terms are problematic. And by the way, it's not just me. No one is going to be able to do this because it doesn't make sense given the category that we're talking about. Thinking about the lost opportunities, if you had just taken the piece of paper at face value instead of asking the question, it's almost scary in retrospect how much that would limit your growth as a business owner.
Oh, absolutely. And in regards to Helen's mention about insurance requirements, I see that all the time because I'm providing a delivered good. So they want, anyone who's involved in that delivery, they want, them to carry insurance and whatnot. And I don't, my company, my business model, I don't have my own delivery fleet. So I never physically, have employees deliver a product directly to my customer. I'm using common carriers like UPS and FedEx and On Track, for example. So when I see T's and C's that include insurance requirements asking for automobile insurance, when I'm not physically delivering anything, I always bring that up. But one of the interesting things I learned a while ago was, for example, because I got this contract, I did have to provide them with proof of insurance because there were other things they wanted, like general liability. They wanted to be listed on as a writer. And after talking with my insurance agent about some of the other things like the workers' comp they wanted and the automobile insurance, there actually already were other writers in my policy that, even though I didn't, for example, have a fleet of trucks, to deliver products with, those writers actually still covered me for the automobile requirement. So if I had not actually been talking with my agent, I wouldn't have known that I actually already did meet the requirement for those extra things, the extra requirements they were asking for the insurance, because I had those extra writers that I didn't actually know about. So it helps me actually being in touch with my agent and learning more about my policy that, in the past where I might have thought I would have been disqualified because of, an insurance requirement, for example, I actually had already had a writer that covered those things. So if I hadn't even talked with them, I wouldn't have known that either.
And it really does drive home that point about, you do have to own it, right? As the individual business owner, if you want to grow, you have to sort of assume the system is not out there to protect you. Everyone is sort of covering their own risks. Helen, one good news story, which I think would be easy to miss because 16% is not a particularly exciting number. But if we think about the fact that 16% of the people who participated in the poll said that small suppliers complain about procurement slow processes, are you with me? Do you think we can sort of celebrate that? I mean, only 16% are complaining that procurement is too slow. And maybe that's because supplier-facing systems have sped up or we are being more responsive through email. I'm not sure we would get that same 16% if we were polling internal stakeholders and distributed buyers. But what do you think? Is there good news in that 16%?
Yeah, I think so, Kelly, and I think that perhaps it's a bit like the iceberg, isn't it? That the bit that the suppliers see, the quick bit, perhaps the slower bit is the bit that happens before we might go out for a sourcing exercise. So that's good news, and we've just published a bit of research this week about the request process and about some of the interesting outcomes from that when the thing gets into the supplier domain. But the other thing I thought was quite nice, it depends where you look at it, is that P2P is getting all the blame for the delays, not procurement, which is the straight payments. So perhaps we're just seen by suppliers as the bit in the middle. But no, that is good news, and I think that will potentially be down to using technology. When I first started in procurement, it was very sort of very formal envelopes and labels and printed tenders and documents and all of that, and now it's all submitted on sort of hubs and things like that. So that is good news. I think that is good news, because that bit where you're waiting to hear whether you've won the work is probably the most nerve-wracking bit for a supplier of the whole process. You've done the work, you've submitted the bid, now you're waiting to hear if you're the one.
And that whole part about where is my money for the stuff that I delivered, right? That's a big concern for suppliers too. And so hopefully the systems that we've put in place not only speed up the whole ordering and onboarding process, but also at least give them some type of independent visibility into exactly where is the PO in the process of being approved, when is it likely to be paid, when should we be looking for the money. That's important information for suppliers to have.
And I think that one interesting thing about big customer opportunity or obstacle is that payment thing, that actually it looks like from some of the data that we've got here in the UK, the government has a requirement for the publication of payment practice reports. And, it does look like the bigger the organisation, the slower the payments. So, some of the ones on the naughty step at the moment, from what I can see on the government website, is Big Pharma, which is surprising, given they're the ones getting all the money at the moment.
That's right.
And construction as well. So that's a little bit of a worry, because obviously the bigger corporations do have the resources to implement some of these really high-end ERP systems that do have the functionality in it to get people paid, on time. So that was just a little bit worrying. I thought that the bigger corporations were lagging behind a little bit on payment terms. Not all of them,
sure,
but some of them.
Now, as we come to the end of the half hour, Helen and Heather, I'm thrilled that you both were able to join me. I've taken down some notes, and I'm going to be adding these last thing into my newsletter before I send it out. I'll also be resharing the recording. I would recommend everybody that's listening in. One of the nice things about the audio events is that it makes it very easy for you to click on our different profile images and names and invite us to connect. Please do reach out. Let us know if you have other thoughts or questions. But as we wrap, not only do I want to thank both of you for your thoughts and your participation, but this is a great opportunity to test out one of the pieces of functionality of the LinkedIn live audio events. If everybody who's listening in would take a look at that react button and help me thank Heather and Helen by giving them a silent but resounding round of applause. I appreciate this is a new type of platform. Thank you, Nick. There you go. This is a new type of platform, but I think it's engaging. And so not only would I recommend that you reach out to me and Helen and Heather about the subject matter of today's conversation, but I would also love to hear your thoughts about the LinkedIn live audio event as well. It's still in beta test. I know they're rolling it out slowly, and we're all sort of experimenting with it in different ways. But let us know your questions, your thoughts, what it was like to participate in the audience, and if there's anything that you would be interested in hearing us talk about in future weeks. So on that note, Helen and Heather, thank you both so much. Thank you to everybody in the listening audience that joined us. I appreciate your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday.
Thanks, Kelly.